"I'll sign it," Charlotte said, and the pen felt heavier than anything she'd ever held. Across the table, Caleb Ashworth didn't move. He just watched her the way a man watches weather coming in off the plains, calm, unhurried, already prepared for whatever came next. He was 36. He'd never married. And in 3 days he would own the deed to her family's debt, and to her. Her father couldn't meet her eyes. Her mother stood by the stove, with her hand pressed flat against her chest like she was holding something in that wanted to come out. The lamp on the table threw long shadows across the contract, across the dotted line, across the careful black ink that spelled out everything Charlotte Bennett was about to give away. She was 23. 3 days ago, she hadn't known Caleb Ashworth's name. Now she was about to become his wife. If this is the kind of story that gets under your skin, stay with it. Subscribe, and before you go, tell me what town you're listening from tonight. I like knowing how far these stories travel. The morning everything changed, Charlotte had been up to her elbows in laundry water when her father called her in from the yard. She knew something was wrong before she even dried her hands. Her father, Walter Bennett, had a particular way of going quiet when trouble had found them. Not the comfortable quiet of a man resting, but the brittle kind like a fence post about to give. She'd heard that silence before. The summer the wheat failed. The winter their horse went lame and they'd had to sell it for half what it was worth. This silence had the same shape except heavier. She wiped her hands on her apron and stepped into the front room. Her father sat at the table with his hat in his lap, turning it slowly between his fingers. Her mother, Agnes, stood near the window, arms crossed, knuckles pale. "Sit, Charlotte," her father said. "I'll stand," she said. "Just tell me." He exhaled the way men do when they've been holding something in for hours. "We owe $400 to the bank in Millbrook. The note's due in 2 weeks. If we don't pay it, they take the land." Charlotte felt the floor tilt slightly under her, though nothing in the room had moved. $400 was an amount so far beyond what they had that it might as well have been 4,000. Their farm brought in enough to feed them and little else. There was no $400. There had never been $400. "How," she said carefully, "do you intend to pay it?" Her father didn't answer right away. It was her mother who finally spoke, her voice tight. "Caleb Ashworth came by yesterday, while you were at the Doyle's place." The name settled into the room like a stone dropped into still water. Charlotte had heard of Caleb Ashworth her whole life without ever once speaking to him. Everyone in Birchwood Hollow knew the name, the way they knew a storm system was building somewhere north of the valley. Not from any one thing he'd done, but from the weight people gave the name when they said it. He ran the largest horse ranch for 60 miles in any direction. He kept entirely to himself. He paid his hands more than any other rancher in the county, and never explained why. He didn't attend the church socials, didn't drink at the tavern in town, and on the rare occasion he was seen on Main Street, people made room for him without quite knowing why they did it. Not because he was cruel. No one had ever accused him of cruelty. It was something else. A stillness in him, like a man who had already calculated every possible outcome of a conversation before it started, and found most of them unnecessary. "What does Caleb Ashworth have to do with our debt?" Charlotte said. Her father set his hat on the table, finally looking up at her. "He's offering to pay it, all of it. The banknote, clear, in exchange for what?" The silence that followed told her everything before her father said a single word. "He wants a wife," her father said, "and he asked for you." Charlotte stood very still. Somewhere outside, a rooster called, indifferent to the way her entire life had just rearranged itself in the space of one sentence. "You said no," she said. It wasn't quite a question. Her father's face told her otherwise. "Charlotte, if we lose this land, we lose everything. Your mother's been sick all winter. We can't feed ourselves through another season without it. I told him I needed to speak with you first. That's the only promise I made him. And if I refuse, then we lose the farm. And I don't know what becomes of any of us." She looked at her mother, hoping for some sign that this was a thing she could simply decline, that there was another way through it that nobody had thought of yet. But her mother's eyes were wet and steady, and there was nothing in them but the quiet plea of a woman who had already done the math and come up short every time. That night Charlotte didn't sleep. She lay in the small room she'd had since she was a girl, and stared at the ceiling, turning the offer over and over, looking for an escape route that didn't exist. She thought about the bank taking the house. She thought about her mother's cough, the one that had settled into her chest in November and hadn't fully left. She thought about her father's hands, how they'd started to shake slightly in the cold, how he was getting too old to start over somewhere new. By morning she had her answer, even though it felt less like a choice and more like the only door left, standing in a house that was burning down around her. She rode out to the Ashworth ranch herself, without telling her parents she was going. It took the better part of 2 hours, the road climbing steadily until the Bennett farm disappeared behind her, and the land opened into something wider, wilder, fenced in long unbroken lines that spoke of a man who didn't do anything halfway. She found him in the breaking corral, working a young gray horse on a lead line, patient and unhurried, even as the animal tossed its head and tested the rope. He didn't stop when she rode up. He simply glanced toward her, registered who she was, and finished what he was doing before he came to the fence. Up close, he was not what she expected. She'd built him in her mind as something harder, colder, but his eyes when they met hers were simply watchful, the way a man's eyes are when he's spent his life reading animals and weather instead of people. "Miss Bennett," he said. "Mr. Ashworth." She kept her chin level. "I want to understand the terms before I agree to anything." Something in his expression shifted. Not but something close to respect. "Fair enough," he told her plainly. He would clear her family's debt in full. In exchange, she would marry him, live on his ranch, and run his household. He made no promises about affection. He made no claims about what kind of husband he intended to be, only that she would be fed, sheltered, and treated with respect under his roof. "And if it doesn't work," she said, "if I find I can't live this way, then we'll discuss it," he said. "I'm not in the business of trapping anyone, Miss Bennett. I'm only trying to solve a problem the same as you are." It wasn't romantic. It wasn't even particularly kind, on the surface. But there was an honesty in it that steadied her more than any tender word could have. He wasn't pretending this was anything other than what it was, and somehow that honesty was the thing that made her say yes. The wedding took place 8 days later in the front room of the county clerk's house, with no guests beyond her parents and his foreman, an older man named Hugh Pierce, who watched the whole proceeding with an expression Charlotte couldn't quite read. There were no flowers. There was no dress beyond her best blue cotton, mended at the hem. When the clerk pronounced them married, Caleb Ashworth took her hand for the first time, briefly, formally, and said only, "Thank you for trusting me with this." She didn't know yet whether she trusted him at all. But the debt was gone, the farm was saved, and her mother had wept with relief in a way Charlotte had never seen before. Whatever this marriage was, it had already done what it needed to do. The ride to the Ashworth ranch took most of the afternoon. Charlotte sat beside her new husband in near silence, watching unfamiliar country roll past, trying to memorize landmarks so she wouldn't feel entirely lost in her own life. The ranch house, when it finally came into view, was larger and plainer than she expected. Sturdy, well-built, utterly without ornament, much like the man who owned it. Inside, it was clean but spare, the kind of clean that came from neglect rather than care. There were no curtains, no rugs, no sign that a woman had ever lived there, or that anyone had given much thought to comfort at all. "You'll want to change things," Caleb said, watching her take it in. "Do as you like with the house. I won't interfere, even with money, within reason." A faint, almost imperceptible note of dry humor entered his voice. "I'd ask that you not redo the whole place before supper." It was the first thing close to a joke she'd heard from him, and it caught her so off guard that she nearly smiled before she caught herself. That first week, Charlotte threw herself into the work of making the house livable, partly because it needed doing, and partly because it gave her something to do with her hands that wasn't sitting alone with her thoughts. She scrubbed floors that hadn't been scrubbed properly in years. She found fabric in town for curtains and sewed them herself in the evenings. She reorganized the kitchen entirely, much to the visible confusion of the cook, a kind, weathered woman named Florence, who'd been running the household kitchen alone for longer than she cared to admit. "If I'm to run this household," Charlotte told Florence on her third day, "I intend to run it properly." Florence studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly, something like approval settling into her face. About time somebody did. Caleb said little about any of it, but Charlotte noticed things. He noticed too. He noticed when she'd reorganized the pantry shelves. He noticed when she'd hung the new curtains in the front room. He never commented directly, but small things began to shift, A vase appeared on the porch one afternoon, clearly purchased in town, set down without a word. A length of good wool fabric arrived from Millbrook a week later, with no note attached, simply left on her sewing table. She didn't know what to make of him. He was not warm, not in any way she recognized warmth. But he was attentive in a manner that felt almost more honest than warmth. Watchful, careful, quietly responsive to things she hadn't said out loud. The hands on the ranch were a different matter entirely. There were 11 of them, men of all ages, most of whom regarded their employer with a loyalty that bordered on reverence. Charlotte began learning their names slowly, learning which ones had wives and children on the small parcels of land. Caleb let them keep at the edge of the property, which ones had nowhere else to go and had found something like family in this place. He doesn't talk much. One of the younger hands, a boy named Frank, told her one afternoon while she brought water out to the corral. But he paid off my brother's medical bill 3 winters back. Never said a word about it. Just did it. It was the first of many such stories she'd hear in the weeks that followed, small unspoken acts of generosity that Caleb never claimed credit for and seemed almost embarrassed to have revealed. The picture that formed in her mind was nothing like the man Birchwood Hollow had described to her growing up. The town had given her a monster wrapped in silence. What she was finding instead was a man who had simply stopped expecting anyone to understand him, and had quietly decided that being understood mattered less than doing right by the people around him. Still, there was distance between them. They ate supper together each evening, mostly in silence, the kind of silence that wasn't hostile but wasn't yet comfortable either. Charlotte found herself watching him across the table some evenings, trying to reconcile the rumors with the reality, trying to understand what exactly she had agreed to and what, if anything, it might become. One evening, nearly a month into the marriage, she finally asked the question that had been sitting in her chest since the morning her father told her the terms. "Why me?" she said. "You could have married any woman in the county who didn't need saving. Why offer to clear a debt for a stranger?" Caleb was quiet for a long moment, turning his cup slowly between his hands. "I watched you in town once before any of this, month ago. You were helping an old woman whose cart had lost a wheel in the rain with half the street walking past and pretending not to see. You didn't know anyone was watching. You just did it." Charlotte didn't remember the moment specifically. It had been such a small thing, the kind of thing she wouldn't have thought twice to mention to anyone. "That's it," she said. "That's why. It told me something true about you," he said. "I've found that's rarer than people think." It wasn't a declaration of love. It was something quieter, and in its own way, more disarming, an admission that he had been paying attention to her long before she'd ever known he existed, not out of possessiveness, but out of a kind of careful, deliberate noticing that seemed to be the only language he had. Neither of them said much else that evening, but when he rose to carry his plate to the basin, he carried hers as well, without being asked, the way he'd begun doing more and more often without comment. The town, when word spread that Charlotte Bennett had married Caleb Ashworth, did not take it kindly. Women she'd known her whole life began speaking to her in careful, pitying tones, as though she'd been sold into something shameful. At the general store in Millbrook, she overheard 2 women discussing her in lowered voices that weren't quite low enough. "Poor girl," one of them said. "Trading herself for her father's debt. What choice did she really have?" Charlotte wanted to correct them, to explain the conversation she'd had at the breaking corral, the terms she'd negotiated herself, the choice that had been hers even if it hadn't been easy. But she said nothing. Let them believe what they wanted. The truth was hers to know, not theirs to approve of. It was harder, though, when the gossip reached Caleb directly. At a supply run into town together, a man named Garrison Whitfield, a local merchant with more opinions than sense, made a remark just loud enough to be heard. Something about Caleb needing to buy himself a wife, since no decent woman would have him plain. Charlotte felt her whole body go rigid with anger. But before she could speak, Caleb simply turned to the man, unhurried, and said in a voice so calm it was almost worse than shouting, "You'll watch how you speak of my wife, Garrison. I won't ask twice." It wasn't a threat exactly. It was a statement of fact, delivered the way he delivered everything, without theater. But the merchant went pale and mumbled an apology, and word of the exchange traveled through town faster than the original insult had. That night, riding home in the wagon, Charlotte found herself studying her husband's profile in the fading light. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "I wanted to," he said simply. "You're not a thing I bought, Charlotte. I won't have anyone speak as though you are." It was the first time he'd called her by her name instead of Miss Bennett, or, more recently, simply Charlotte in passing reference. Something in the way he said it now, deliberate and careful, settled into her chest like warmth spreading from a hearth. By late spring, something had shifted between them that neither of them named directly, but both of them seemed to feel. Their silences at supper had grown comfortable rather than strained. He'd begun telling her small things about the ranch, about the horses, about decisions he was weighing, asking her opinion in a way that suggested he valued it, rather than simply tolerated her presence. She found herself looking forward to these conversations, to the particular way he listened, fully, without interrupting, as though her thoughts mattered enough to be heard all the way through. One afternoon she found him in the barn, working alone on a young foal that had been struggling to gain weight. He didn't hear her come in. She watched him for a long moment, the gentleness in his big hands, the low, steady murmur of his voice as he coaxed the animal to trust him, the patience that asked nothing in return. "You're good with them," she said finally. He looked up, something almost sheepish crossing his face at being caught in an unguarded moment. "Animals don't lie to you, don't pretend to be something they're not, easier to know where you stand. Is that why you prefer them to people?" A faint, almost rueful smile touched his mouth. "Used to think so. Lately, I'm not so certain." It was as close as he'd come to admitting that something in him was changing too, and Charlotte carried the warmth of it with her for days. The real test of their marriage came in early summer, when a man Charlotte had never met arrived at the ranch unannounced, claiming an old debt of his own, one that, it emerged, predated Charlotte's arrival entirely. The man, a sharp-eyed lawyer named Reginald Pratt, representing a distant cousin of Caleb's late father, arrived with papers attempting to claim a portion of the ranch under a contested inheritance clause from decades past. For 3 tense weeks, the household existed under the shadow of potential ruin. Caleb grew quieter than usual, spending long hours in his study with old deeds and letters, trying to untangle a legal knot that threatened to undo everything he'd built. Charlotte, rather than retreating to the edges of the crisis as she suspected the old version of herself might have, planted herself firmly in the middle of it. She read through documents alongside him late into the night. She rode into Millbrook to track down the county records herself. She found, buried in an old ledger at the courthouse, a witness letter from Caleb's father that contradicted the cousin's claim entirely. When she laid the letter on the desk in front of Caleb, his expression was unreadable for a long moment before something in it cracked open. Relief, gratitude, something that looked almost like astonishment. "You didn't have to do this," he said quietly. "You're my husband," she said. "This is my home, too." "Of course I did." It was the first time she'd said it so plainly, and the words seemed to land somewhere deep in him. He reached across the desk and took her hand. Not formally this time, not as a gesture for show, but simply because he needed to hold on to something. "Charlotte," he said, "I need to tell you something, and I'd rather say it badly than not say it at all. I didn't marry you to solve a problem. I told myself that's what it was. But I think I knew. The moment you rode up to that corral and asked me to lay out the terms instead of simply accepting whatever I offered, that you were the kind of woman I'd been waiting my whole life to meet, and had given up believing existed." Charlotte felt something in her chest finally unclench, some last guarded place she hadn't realized she'd been protecting. "I think I knew something too," she said. "I just didn't have the words for it until now." The court matter was resolved within the month. The false claim dismissed once the letter was entered into evidence, the lawyer Pratt departing Birchwood Hollow with considerably less confidence than he'd arrived with. But something more lasting had been settled in that study than any legal dispute, an understanding between two people who had begun as strangers bound by necessity and had become, slowly, and without either of them quite noticing the exact moment it happened. Something neither of them had words sturdy enough to fully describe, except to call it love. By autumn, the household had a different rhythm entirely. The hands had stopped treating Charlotte as an outsider and started treating her as the woman who ran the place, with a respect that had been earned rather than granted. Florence had taken to humming while she worked, something Charlotte hadn't heard from her in the early days. The curtains Charlotte had sewn that first week had faded slightly in the sun, and neither of them had any interest in replacing them, because they'd come to mean something neither wanted to lose. One evening, as the harvest moon hung low and orange over the western fields, Charlotte found Caleb on the porch, the way she often did now at the end of the day. She sat beside him without a word, and after a while he reached over and took her hand, the way he did almost without thinking now, as naturally as breathing. "Town still talks," she said, "about how we started. Let them," he said. "They don't know the half of it." "No," she agreed, leaning her head against his shoulder as the last light faded from the sky. "They never will." And somewhere beneath the quiet of that evening, beneath the years still ahead of them that neither could yet see, was the simple truth that what had begun as a transaction between two desperate strangers had become, against every expectation either of them carried into that first cold meeting, the steadiest and most honest thing either of them had ever known.